So I'm hoping that we can get these pro-growth policies in place for the rest of this year under the Trump administration. And I also hope that Congress can rein in the Federal Reserve. We need to get some transparency on what's happening behind the scenes on the Federal Reserve, because it is the one that's creating the inflation. Hello, welcome to this week's economy. I'm your host, Dr. Vance Ginn. Thank you for joining me again today. I hope you're having a prosperous day. A lot of stuff's been going on. What I want to do today is provide you with a little bit of an overview about what's happened in the economy as we start 2025. We have a new administration, Congress, and everything else. And so we need to see how this is shaping up. I'm going to discuss the latest jobs report, inflation trends, and the federal and state spending. All right. So number one, fueling American jobs. The latest Bureau of Labor Statistics jobs report reveals concerning trends. Job growth estimates continue to be revised downward, and the number of jobs added in 2024 declined by 10%, over 200,000. This highlights the need to review monthly reports with caution. Household employment rose by 308,000 in 2024, the weakest growth for a full year outside of a recession in decades. Labor force participation rate remains below 2019 levels before the pandemic, indicating more are out of the labor force than expected. Inflation-adjusted weekly earnings are starting to increase again, as they did in 2024, but this is the first time since 2021. So this is why so many people are feeling well behind the curve when it comes to how much that they can purchase and their purchasing power. My recommendations here are that we need to diagnose the weakness. I think that we're starting to see more of the media on the left actually acknowledge that there are weaknesses going on, which is a good sign. You've got to acknowledge the problem before you can do something about it. But there are still a lot of other weaknesses that remain that I don't think we need to just roll over and say, hey, this is what's happening, and this is the way it's always going to be, and everything else. A lot of this was driven, in my view, from government failures, whether it be from the excessive government spending and the lockdowns during the COVID lockdown situation, or thereafter with all the excessive spending by Biden administration and the increases in regulations, and then the Fed printing all of that debt, putting too much money in circulation and creating inflation. I still think there's a lot of asset price inflation that's out there, whether it be the stock market, which still have high PE ratios, the price to earning ratios, or the housing market, which many people can't even afford, even if they have quite a bit of income, because higher interest rates and higher values, and many people are locked in their homes, right? In the sense that they don't want to move. If they leave, they sell, they get all that income, but then they've got to go buy something that's even probably more expensive, or get a smaller house and pay a higher interest rate. And so what that does is it creates a situation where supply is artificially kept, depressed, or not as much supply in the market. At the same time, demand is easing some because interest rates are higher, but it's still going up as population increases and everything else. And so, yes, housing prices will stay up longer than they otherwise would because of these dynamics in the market. But I also think that there is a bubble that's got to burst at some point, given the dynamics that are out there. And that's going to contribute to slower economic growth and other things. And we're still seeing inflation rearing its ugly head, which I'll talk about some more in a minute. So I think what we really want, though, is less government in our lives, right? Less government spending, less taxes, less regulation, all those things. And that will help to increase the supply of housing. That will help to reduce the deficit in debt and put the lower pressure on interest rates and inflation as well. So there's a lot of key parts that I think we've got to get government failure solved first with less government and not trying to bring in more government to solve those problems that were created by government in the beginning. That's a lot of the national conservatism movement and the populist movement, America First movement. There's some issues there that I think are positive in general, the things they're talking about, but their solutions are usually more government. That's what really worries me. We need less government out there in the market, okay? So number two, addressing inflation. Examining the data, you could see that under Biden, we had excessive spending and regulatory overreach that led to rising deficits, while the Fed's money printing pushed inflation to 40-year highs, eroding real wages. Average weekly earnings adjusted for inflation have been down about 2% since April of 2020, when everything shut down, right? When Biden took office in 2021 as well, they're still around that time as well. So the result has been higher cost and fewer opportunities for Americans. My recommendations here is that there are unique challenges facing the economy economy today. As the Federal Reserve raises borrowing costs to fight inflation, ongoing tariffs only add to the rising cost of goods already impacted by persistent inflation. And now we've had the Fed lowering their interest rates, putting more money into circulation here recently. At the same time, they're running more than $200 billion in losses. It's one of the reasons why the CFPB should be eliminated, because the Federal Reserve, the way that the Congress set this up was that the Federal Reserve is the one that funds the CFPB. They're running $200 billion in losses. Most businesses would be failing by now and closing their doors, and instead they're continuing. I did see recently that the Fed gained about $400 million in gains. I won't say profits because they can't profit, right? But there's a gains there. So maybe this is starting to turn the tide. But in general, they're still down $200 billion just over the last couple of years. This is just ridiculous. And their balance sheet is still remains $6.8 trillion. There's too much money circulating in the economy. So I'm hoping that we can get these pro-growth policies in place for the rest of this year under the Trump administration. And I also hope that Congress can rein in the Federal Reserve, have Ron Paul out at the Fed, have the Doge out at the Fed. We need to get some transparency on what's happening behind the scenes on the Federal Reserve, because it is the one that's creating the inflation, creating a lot of the monetary distortions that are out there in the economy. Not only do you have fiscal policy, but you have monetary policy creating problems as well. And then regulatory policy is a whole other thing, right? We've got all this uncertainty. We've got to remove the certain uncertainty, and we'll have much more economic growth and prosperity. All right. Number 3, supporting free trade. Examining the issue here, President Trump has criticized the record high trade deficit, but the same data show U.S. exports also hit a record, signaling strong global demand. Trade benefits Americans by providing goods no longer made domestically or available at lower cost that people are willing to pay for, reflecting strong consumer demand. The U.S. economy benefits from these trade arrangements. My recommendations are that the tariffs on Americans that are taxes, really, right, are just raising prices and straining households already struggling with inflation. So far, we've heard that the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico are suspended for 30 days, so we don't have to worry about that, thank the Lord. But now there's an additional 10% tariffs on China, right? And so that means additional cost for all of us who are buying goods from China and other places. And by the way, a lot of our imports are actually intermediate goods. So they're not the final good. They go into the manufacturing process, which means it hurts a lot of businesses in the process, okay? So this is not a good situation. That's why we need to get rid of this idea of trade, of tariffs out there and protectionism in general. What we need to do is lower the cost of doing business here. Lowering the corporate income taxes, making the Trump tax cuts permanent, spending less will be huge, and deregulation. All these things would be huge for American economy. If you think about America first, that's really where we should be heading. And we need better trade policy, okay? Revisiting trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, boosting U.S. competitiveness and creating more opportunities. We could do that through a pro-growth, free trade agenda. Let's do it, okay? All right. The next point here for number 4 is confronting federal spending, examining the issues with the national debt surpassing $36 trillion, which is 125% of GDP. This crisis can no longer be ignored. Under Trump and Biden, reckless spending has driven annual deficits to $2 trillion, destabilizing the economy and burdening Americans with higher prices and uncertainty. My recommendation here is that we got to address the spending problem. It's a bipartisan fiscal problem that happened from Republican administrations, Democrat administrations, Republican Congresses, Democrat Congresses. They all want to spend more of your money. That's how they can get reelected, right? They've got to be rent seekers in order to get your vote. So it's easier to hand out things and give out tax cuts, and you get a car and you get a car. If you think about Oprah, okay? But at the end of the day, that's hurting us. We've got to learn that there's nothing is free. No free lunch, as Milton Friedman would say. And I'm hopeful that something like the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, can come in with Elon Musk and others and say, let's cut the waste, fraud, and abuse. And you have Russ Vought now at OMB. He was recently confirmed. I think that's huge. I may not agree with him on everything on policy, but I usually agree with him on the fiscal hawk side when it comes to the budget. And I know that he was a fiscal hawk when I was there at OMB, and we looked at a lot of savings. In fact, the president's last budget that we worked on, we found $4.6 trillion in savings. They should find at least that amount this time around, and as quickly as possible, and then put in strict spending limit tied to a maximum of population growth plus inflation for the future. So cut spending now, all right? right? And then rein in the growth rate over time. If we do that and allow for more economic growth through pro-growth policies, like I mentioned before, we could have additional growth and lower spending, and we could balance the budget within the next decade, if not sooner. In fact, I've done some research that shows that if we limited spending to 1% per year and had about an additional 1 percentage point increase in economic growth per year through pro-growth policies, we could balance the budget in 6 years. This can be done. It doesn't have to take a huge spending cuts like you and I probably would like. It could actually be done through just slowing the growth of things. Let's do it and increasing economic growth. All right. Number 5, setting state spending limits. While the federal government can run deficits, issue bonds, and print money, state governments operate under stricter fiscal constraints. Nearly all states require balanced budgets through an amendment or statute, and most enforce tax and expenditure limits. This necessity fosters disciplined budgeting to maintain stability without stifling economic prosperity. From 2014 to 2023, data from the Sustainable Budget Project from Americans for Tax Reform, where I am now a staff economist and excited about it, they revealed the costly impact excessive state spending. Aggregate state spending, which excludes federal funds, so we don't double count here, rose by 61.1% over that 20-year period. Had spending been limited, over that 10-year period from 2014 to 2023, had spending been limited to population growth plus inflation in those states, states would have spent $1.44 trillion in 2023, which is $454 billion less than the actual 1.89 trillion, meaning that we could have saved nearly $500 billion a year in taxes had they just matched spending to population plus inflation. Now, if you consider federal government and state governments had followed the sustainable budgeting practices, taxpayers could have saved over $2.5 trillion just in 2023 alone, funds that could have been invested in businesses, job creation, wage growth, and a lot more, and just money and more money in people's pockets. $2.5 trillion more, okay? So we need to keep that going. Spending limits matter because it ties the hand and reduces the discretion of these politicians who want to spend and tax less and forces them for good, sound fiscal policy, which then allows for us to not have as much in debt for the Federal Reserve to print, rising up interest rates, raising up inflation and everything else. And this provides a stronger economy with lower burdens and more opportunities for people to prosper in the process. All right. So that's what I got for you today. Thanks for joining me in this episode of This Week's Economy. For more insights, visit vanceginn.com and get even greater value with a paid subscription or a complimentary subscription to my Substack newsletter at vanceginn.substack.com. Don't forget to check out my Let People Prosper agenda for more on my website. You can see that right on the front page, the Let People Prosper agenda. Check it out. And until next time, God bless you and let people prosper.